In a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Charlotte, North Carolina, Kevin and Ashley Moore lived a life that many would consider ideal. Married for over a decade, they had a stable home, a dog named Bruno, and careers that provided them with financial security. From the outside, their life seemed perfect. Kevin was a dedicated engineer, and Ashley worked as a medical assistant in a local clinic. They had everything they could ever need, or so it seemed. Kevin and Ashley's relationship had once been filled with the excitement of young love, spontaneous dates, and late-night conversations that went on until the early morning. But as the years passed, their connection began to fade into something much more mundane. Kevin had become engrossed in his work, often staying late at the office or taking on extra shifts to climb the corporate ladder. Ashley, on the other hand, was finding herself growing increasingly discontent with her life. She loved Kevin, but the spark that once existed between them seemed to have disappeared. Over time, their conversations became shallow. They no longer spent time together outside of the house, except for the occasional trip to the grocery store or the usual dinners with friends. Ashley would get home from her long shifts at the clinic, only to find Kevin lounging on the couch, watching TV, too tired to engage in meaningful conversation. Despite being surrounded by people, Ashley began to feel incredibly lonely. Her job, though rewarding in its own way, was emotionally draining. She worked with patients who were often in pain or suffering from chronic conditions, and it took a toll on her mental health. She was always trying to help others, but no one seemed to notice her own emotional exhaustion. At the end of each day, she was left feeling empty, as though she had given everything she had without receiving anything in return. It wasn't that Kevin didn't care about her, it was just that he didn't understand the depth of her dissatisfaction. He was a man of routine, someone who valued stability above all else. He would bring home groceries and fix things around the house, but he never seemed to notice the subtle shifts in Ashley's demeanor. She was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with, but he didn't see it. He thought things were fine, just the way they were. One fateful day, Ashley met a new colleague at the clinic. Ryan was a few years younger than her, recently transferred from another clinic in the city. He was friendly, charming, and had a way of making Ashley feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. It started innocently enough, just casual conversations during their breaks and a shared cup of coffee in the mornings. But as the days passed, their conversations became more personal, more meaningful. Ryan seemed genuinely interested in Ashley's thoughts and feelings. He asked her about her day and listened intently as she spoke about the difficulties she faced in her job. He made her laugh, and for the first time in a long while, Ashley felt like someone truly understood her. It was comforting. She found herself looking forward to seeing him at work, counting down the minutes until their next conversation. Ashley knew that this wasn't normal. She was married, and Kevin was a good man. She had no intentions of betraying him, but the connection she felt with Ryan was undeniable. She tried to push the thoughts of him out of her mind, but they lingered. The more she talked to Ryan, the more she felt alive again, the more she realized how much she had been missing. But she still held on to her marriage, convincing herself that this was just a harmless friendship. Then, one evening, things changed. It was another night when Kevin stayed late at the office, as he often did. He hadn't called or texted to let Ashley know what time he would be home. By the time she finished dinner, there was no sign of him. Ashley was tired, emotionally drained, and, as usual, spent the evening alone in their quiet house. After her evening routine, she found herself reaching out to Ryan. They had exchanged a few messages over the past week, but this time something felt different. The conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. Ryan was warm and kind, and his words made Ashley feel more connected than she had in months. It didn't take long before he suggested they meet up for a drink after work. Ashley hesitated, but only for a moment. The thought of spending time with Ryan, away from the loneliness of her home, was too tempting to resist. When they met up that night, the chemistry between them was undeniable. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in a long while, Ashley felt alive. After a few drinks, Ryan took her hand in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to enjoy the attention he was giving her, the attention that she hadn't received from Kevin in so long. The evening ended with a lingering kiss outside of the bar, a kiss that Ashley hadn't expected, but one that she couldn't deny felt right in the moment. She pulled away, feeling a rush of guilt, but also a strange sense of relief. It was the first time in a long while that she felt desired, and the sensation was intoxicating. When Ashley returned home later that night, Kevin was already asleep. She slipped into bed next to him, her mind racing with what had just happened. She tried to shake off the feeling, tried to convince herself that it was just a moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. The line between right and wrong had already begun to blur. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unease. Ashley tried to act as though nothing had changed, but she could feel the tension building inside her. Her thoughts kept drifting back to that night, to the kiss with Ryan that she couldn't shake from her mind. It was a new kind of attention, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, and it had awakened something inside her that she thought had long been dormant. She continued to go through the motions of her daily life. She greeted Kevin with a smile in the mornings, prepared his breakfast, and kissed him goodbye before he left for work. They still had dinner together, though the conversations had become increasingly hollow. Kevin would talk about his day at the office, but Ashley wasn't really listening. Her mind was elsewhere, on Ryan, on the way he made her feel alive in a way Kevin no longer did. The guilt gnawed at her, but the pull toward Ryan was undeniable. They exchanged messages regularly, sharing small snippets of their days, and the more they talked, the more Ashley realized how much she had been yearning for a connection that had nothing to do with routine or obligation. It was a dangerous temptation, but it was one she couldn't resist. The next time they met, it was at a local cafe, a quiet place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. Ashley was hesitant at first, but as soon as she saw Ryan, that same rush of excitement flooded her chest. He greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a table by the window. They sat across from each other, and Ashley couldn't help but notice how easily they slipped into conversation. It was as if they had known each other for years, the way their words flowed so naturally. They talked about their childhoods, their hopes and dreams, and for a brief moment, Ashley felt as though she had found someone who truly understood her. Ryan listened intently, never interrupting, and made her feel heard in a way that Kevin had stopped doing a long time ago. The more they talked, the more Ashley found herself opening up to him, revealing parts of herself that she hadn't shared with anyone in years. As they parted ways that afternoon, Ryan walked her to her car and kissed her once again, this time longer, more deliberate. Ashley's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. It was as if something inside her had already made the decision. She wasn't ready to face the consequences of what she was doing, but she also knew that she couldn't stop. The connection with Ryan felt too strong, too real to ignore. Back at home, Kevin was waiting for her, just as he always did. He asked about her day, but Ashley couldn't bring herself to answer him honestly. How could she tell him that she had just shared intimate moments with another man? How could she explain the emotional distance that had grown between them? Instead, she smiled, told him it was fine, and tried to make their evening seem as normal as possible. But nothing felt normal anymore. The guilt continued to build, but it was tempered by the undeniable excitement that came from her secret with Ryan. Ashley felt trapped in a web of her own making, torn between the life she had built with Kevin and the thrilling, dangerous connection she had with Ryan. She was playing a game, and she wasn't sure how it would end, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back to the way things were. Over the next few weeks, their secret meetings became more frequent. They'd meet for coffee, lunch, or a walk in the park, each encounter leaving Ashley feeling more conflicted than before. She had never imagined herself in this situation, but the more time she spent with Ryan, the more she realized that she was craving something she hadn't even known she needed: passion, excitement, and intimacy. She wasn't getting that from Kevin anymore, and Ryan was filling the void in ways that she never thought possible. But as the weeks turned into months, Ashley began to notice cracks in her marriage that she hadn't seen before. Kevin, too, seemed different. He was more distant, more absorbed in his work, and their conversations became even more strained. Ashley couldn't help but wonder if he had started to sense that something was wrong. She had tried so hard to hide the truth, but her guilt was becoming harder to bear, and she couldn't help but wonder if Kevin was starting to pick up on the subtle changes in her behavior. One evening, after a long day at work, Ashley came home to find Kevin sitting in the living room, his eyes fixed on the television. It was as though he hadn't even noticed her arrival. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, wondering if he was truly unaware of the growing distance between them, or if he was simply avoiding it. "Kevin," she said softly, hoping to break the silence. "We need to talk." He turned his head slowly, as if the words were a burden. "About what?" Ashley hesitated. She knew what she wanted to say, but the words stuck in her throat. She had never been good at confronting difficult truths. "About us. About everything." Kevin didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ashley thought he might ask her what was going on, if there was something she wasn't telling him. But instead, he just sighed and turned back to the TV. "I'm tired, Ashley. I don't have the energy for this right now." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. He didn't care enough to even try. And in that moment, Ashley realized that she was alone, completely alone in this marriage. She had been for a long time. And now she was finding comfort in the arms of someone else. Ashley's life began to spiral as she continued to navigate the tangled web of emotions that had entangled her. The guilt and excitement of her affair with Ryan intensified, but so did her awareness of the consequences that loomed over her. Every stolen moment with Ryan felt both exhilarating and suffocating. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, and yet, every time she saw him, she felt like she was living for the first time in years. Kevin, meanwhile, remained largely oblivious. His focus was consumed by his work, and the few times he did seem to engage with her, it was perfunctory at best. He had stopped trying to understand her, stopped noticing the subtle shifts in her behavior, and perhaps that was part of what made it easier for Ashley to continue the affair. She no longer had to hide the emotional void that existed between them because Kevin was no longer looking. But as Ashley and Ryan grew closer, Ashley's internal conflict grew more intense. She had always believed that love was supposed to be a bond between two people, something pure and unbreakable. And yet, here she was, betraying the very vows she had made to Kevin. She tried to justify it to herself, telling herself that her marriage had been dead for years, that Kevin had no interest in her anymore. But deep down, she knew she was making excuses. She had chosen this path because she was no longer willing to live in the lonely world she had built with Kevin. One evening, as she and Ryan met for their usual rendezvous at a quiet restaurant, the gravity of her situation began to hit her harder than ever before. Ryan was different that night. There was an intensity in his eyes, a look that Ashley couldn't quite place. It wasn't the playful, carefree Ryan she had come to know. No, tonight, he was serious. Too serious. As they sat at their table, the clink of silverware on porcelain plates and the hum of conversation from other tables faded into the background. It was as though everything in the world had narrowed down to the two of them, their secret meeting, their forbidden connection. "Ashley," Ryan began, his voice low, his eyes fixed on her. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately." Ashley felt a pang of unease, the kind of feeling that makes your stomach turn. She looked at him, but didn't speak. She knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "I don't want to keep sneaking around," Ryan continued, his voice steady but firm. "I care about you, and I don't think this is sustainable. I don't want to be your secret anymore." Ashley's heart raced, a wave of panic flooding over her. She hadn't been expecting this. She had been so caught up in the excitement of the affair, so consumed by the connection she had with Ryan, that she hadn't thought about the future. She had been living in the moment, but now that moment was starting to feel like it was unraveling. What was she supposed to do? She didn't want to lose Ryan, but the weight of her marriage was a constant reminder that she couldn't just walk away from it. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. "I never meant for this to get so complicated." Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I don't want you to feel trapped, Ashley, but I can't keep being a part of this secret. You need to decide what you want. Do you want to be with me? Or do you want to try and fix things with your husband?" Ashley pulled her hand back, suddenly overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. She had never truly considered the consequences of her actions until this moment. The guilt, the shame, the betrayal, it all hit her at once. She had spent so long justifying her choices to herself, telling herself that Kevin didn't care, that their marriage was over. But now she saw things clearly. What was she really doing? What kind of person had she become? I need some time, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan didn't press her. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. Take all the time you need, Ashley, but just remember, I'm not going to wait forever. You have to make a decision. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ashley's mind was consumed with Ryan's words, the weight of his ultimatum sinking in with each passing minute. She had to choose. But how could she choose? How could she leave Kevin after everything they had been through? After the years of their marriage, the shared memories, the life they had built together. But at the same time, how could she deny what she felt for Ryan? The love, the passion, the connection. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. That night, as she lay in bed next to Kevin, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Kevin had fallen asleep hours ago, but Ashley couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop thinking about the decision she had to make. She had been living in a fog for so long, but now the reality of her situation was clearer than ever. She couldn't keep living this double life. Eventually, one of her worlds had to collapse, and she wasn't sure which one she wanted to lose. In the days that followed, Ashley began to withdraw from Kevin even more. She spent long hours at work, using the excuse of overtime to avoid coming home. When she did return, she found herself picking at her food, distracted and distant. Kevin noticed, of course, but he said nothing. The distance between them had become so vast that he didn't know how to bridge the gap. He had stopped asking questions, stopped trying to engage with her emotionally. It was then that Ashley realized something that shook her to her core. Kevin was just as lost in their marriage as she was. He had stopped trying just as she had. Their love had faded into a distant memory, and neither one of them had done anything to fix it. She had sought attention elsewhere, but in doing so, she had betrayed herself just as much as she had betrayed him. The thought of facing Kevin, of confessing everything to him, felt impossible. But at the same time, she couldn't keep lying to him. She had already crossed a line. She just wasn't sure if it was too late to turn back. Ashley's decision loomed over her like a dark cloud, its weight growing heavier with each passing day. She was caught in a cycle of guilt and desire, torn between the man she had promised to love forever and the man who made her feel more alive than she had in years. Every interaction with Kevin now felt like a performance, a carefully crafted facade that masked the truth of what was happening behind closed doors. She tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that everything was about to unravel. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Ashley came home to find Kevin sitting in their living room, flipping through a magazine. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that hung in the air when something unspoken lingered between two people. Ashley paused at the doorway, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. It wasn't like she could just pretend everything was fine anymore. "Hey," she said softly, her voice lacking the usual warmth it once had. Kevin looked up, his eyes tired but expectant. "Hey, you're home early," he replied, though his tone didn't match the sentiment. It was distant, almost detached. Ashley stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, but she couldn't bring herself to meet it. Instead, she walked past him and sat down at the kitchen table, hands clenched around the edge. Her heart was racing. This was the moment when she had to choose. Kevin sat down next to her, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "What's going on, Ash? You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Ashley looked at him, her heart aching. She had never been good at hiding her emotions, but she had been doing it for so long that now it felt unnatural to be honest. She had kept the truth from him for months, buried it under layers of excuses and lies. But now, sitting across from him, she realized just how much damage she had done. The guilt weighed on her like 1,000 pounds. She began, but her voice faltered. "I don't know how to say this." Kevin's hand tightened around hers. "You can tell me anything, Ash. You know that." But Ashley didn't feel like she could tell him anything anymore. She had built this wall between them, and now it seemed insurmountable. "I've been seeing someone," she blurted out before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air like poison, and she immediately regretted them. Kevin froze, his face draining of color. He pulled his hand away slowly, as though her confession had physically struck him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was unbearable. Ashley couldn't look at him, couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes. I don't understand," Kevin finally said, his voice low and steady, though the pain was unmistakable. "Who is he? When did this start?" Ashley took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It started a while ago. I never meant for it to happen, Kevin. It just did." Kevin's gaze hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "So, you've been lying to me for months?" Ashley nodded, feeling the sting of his words. "Yes," she whispered, unable to look him in the eye. "I never meant to hurt you, Kevin. I didn't know how to fix things with us. I felt so alone. And then Ryan came into my life and—" Her words trailed off as she struggled to find the right ones. How could she explain to him what she had been feeling? How could she tell him that it wasn't just about Ryan? It was about the deep emptiness she had felt for so long in her marriage. But the truth was, it didn't matter. The damage had been done, and there was no way to take it back. Kevin stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't believe this," he muttered, pacing across the room. "You've been cheating on me, and now you want to tell me about it like it's just some small thing? Just like that? How could you do this, Ashley?" The anger in his voice took her by surprise. She had expected him to be hurt, to be disappointed, but she hadn't anticipated this kind of rage. She knew she had broken his trust in the worst possible way, but the intensity of his reaction hit her harder than she expected. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Kevin stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Then why did you keep lying to me? Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy? Why didn't you say something before you decided to destroy everything we had?" Ashley felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't cry, not now. "I didn't know how," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to fix things." Kevin shook his head, disbelief written all over his face. "So you thought sleeping with someone else would fix things? Is that what you thought?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was, she didn't know what she had been thinking. She had acted out of desperation, out of a need for validation, for something, anything, that would make her feel alive again. But now, Looking at Kevin, seeing the pain in his eyes, she realized just how far she had fallen. "Kevin, I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to get this far. I've made a terrible mistake." Kevin's expression softened for a moment, and for a fleeting second it seemed as though he might forgive her. But then the anger returned and he shook his head. I can't just forgive you, Ashley. This isn't something I can forget." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it from his lips was harder than she had imagined. She had shattered everything, and now there was no way to put the pieces back together. "I think it's time we figure out what happens next," Kevin said quietly. "I need space, Ashley. I need to think." Ashley nodded, her heart sinking. She had no idea what was going to happen now, or if there was any way to salvage what was left of their marriage. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Ashley's confession were nothing short of a whirlwind. Kevin's absence from their shared spaces felt suffocating. His presence had always been a constant in her life, but now it seemed as though the house was empty, even though he was still there. He stayed in his office more, and when he did come out, it was with an air of cold indifference. The man she had known for so many years seemed like a stranger now, and Ashley couldn't escape the feeling that their marriage was irreparably broken. For the first time in a long time, Ashley found herself alone with her thoughts. No distractions, no excuses, just the raw reality of what she had done. The guilt consumed her, and the weight of her actions pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. She couldn't shake the image of Kevin's face when she told him about Ryan. She had seen the anger, the betrayal, the hurt in his eyes, and it haunted her every moment since. It was the face of a man who had been let down by the one person he had trusted most. Days turned into weeks, and yet the silence in their home never truly abated. They spoke only when necessary, and even then, their words felt hollow, detached. The small things they used to share, casual conversation over breakfast, laughter in the evening, were gone. What remained was a ghost of the life they had once built together. Ashley tried to focus on work, but even that felt like a mere distraction. The people around her seemed unaware of the storm she was weathering inside. She plastered on a smile for her colleagues, nodded along in meetings, and forced herself to go through the motions. But each night, when she returned to her empty house, the loneliness and regret overwhelmed her. It wasn't just the affair that haunted her. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to get so far lost in her own unhappiness that she hadn't seen how broken everything had become. She had pushed Kevin away with her silence, her neglect, and in turn, she had sought comfort in someone else's arms. She hadn't just hurt Kevin, she had hurt herself too. The life she had known was falling apart, and she couldn't seem to stop it. As the weeks went on, Kevin seemed to retreat even further into himself. He stopped talking to Ashley altogether, and when they did interact, it was as if they were strangers. There was no warmth, no familiarity, just an overwhelming distance between them. It was as if the person who had once been her partner in life no longer existed, and in his place was a man who felt betrayed and abandoned. Ashley had tried reaching out to him. She had attempted to apologize, to make amends, but Kevin wasn't ready to hear her. He was too hurt, too angry. His trust in her had been shattered, and she knew that rebuilding it would take more than words. It would take time, something neither of them had in abundance. One evening, after another silent dinner in which neither of them said a word, Kevin finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable finality to it. "Ashley, I can't keep doing this," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. "I can't pretend like everything is okay when it's not. You broke my trust, and I don't know how to fix that." Ashley's heart sank, but she didn't know what to say. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words from Kevin's lips made it all the more real. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't enough. "I wish I could take it all back. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Kevin didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring out the window as though lost in thought. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression hard. "I think it's time we consider our options," he said quietly. "I need some space. I don't know what I want right now, but I can't keep living like this. We need to figure out if we even have a future together." Ashley nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had hoped that Kevin would want to work things out, that he would be willing to give their marriage another chance. But she knew deep down that things had changed. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The trust had been broken, and whether or not they could rebuild it seemed like an impossible task. For the next few days, Ashley stayed in the guest room, giving Kevin the space he had asked for. The house felt more like a prison than a home, and every time she passed him in the hallway, there was an awkward tension in the air. Neither of them knew what to say or how to act. They were two people who had once shared everything, and now they couldn't even share a glance without feeling the weight of what had happened between them. Ashley spent her nights lying awake in bed, replaying the events in her mind. She thought about her marriage, about the love they once shared, and about how it had all gone wrong. She wondered if there was a way to salvage it, if there was a way to make things right. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had already lost something precious. The bond they had once had seemed like a distant memory, a time before everything became so complicated. Eventually, Kevin came to her with a decision. He didn't want to rush into anything, but he couldn't continue living in limbo either. They needed to figure out whether they could salvage their marriage or whether it was time to part ways. He suggested they take some time apart, give themselves the space to reflect, and then come together to talk about the future. Ashley agreed reluctantly, knowing that this was perhaps the only way to heal. But as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't shake the feeling that the distance between them was only growing. She wasn't sure if they could ever return to the life they had shared before, and that realization weighed heavily on her. In the end, the time apart only deepened their understanding of just how far apart they had grown. Kevin, still hurt and angry, couldn't bring himself to trust Ashley again, and Ashley realized that she could never undo the damage she had caused. Their paths were no longer aligned, and though they had once been a team, now they were two individuals walking in different directions. They decided to divorce. It was an amicable decision, though painful for both of them. They had loved each other once, but sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome betrayal. The months that followed the divorce were difficult for both Ashley and Kevin, albeit in different ways. Their lives, once intertwined so deeply, were now separate, each of them trying to find their own way in a world that no longer felt familiar. The transition from being a married couple to being strangers was gradual, but undeniable. For Kevin, the divorce felt like the final chapter of a book he had never wanted to finish. He had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the idea that love, once found, was meant to endure all challenges. Ashley had been his world, and the betrayal she had inflicted upon him shattered the very foundation of his beliefs. The anger and hurt that had consumed him in the months following the affair began to transform into resignation. He didn't hate Ashley, but he couldn't deny that their relationship had reached its breaking point. The trust that had been the bedrock of their marriage was gone, and once it was broken, it seemed impossible to rebuild. Kevin focused on himself in ways he hadn't in years. He threw himself into his work, dedicating more time to his career, and spent evenings catching up with old friends. Slowly, he regained a sense of independence, rediscovering who he was outside of the relationship. He enrolled in a photography class, something he had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. For the first time in a long time, Kevin felt a spark of excitement for something outside of his job. It wasn't that he had forgotten about the pain of the divorce, but he had learned that he needed to let go, to accept that life moved forward, even when it felt unfair. Kevin also began dating again, though it wasn't easy. Every woman he met seemed to remind him of Ashley in some way, and the emotional scars from his marriage still lingered. He had to confront the fact that part of him would always carry the pain of betrayal, but over time, he learned how to compartmentalize it. He wasn't looking for love immediately. He just wanted to enjoy companionship, something light and unburdened by past mistakes. As for Ashley, her journey was one of self-discovery and redemption. The initial days after the divorce were the hardest. She had moved into a small apartment downtown, far from the life she had once known. The loneliness was overwhelming, and she often found herself staring at the empty walls, regretting the choices that had led her here. Her relationship with Ryan had fizzled out quickly after the affair was revealed, and she realized that she had been seeking validation in the wrong places. Ryan was a fleeting distraction, someone who made her feel desired, but in the end, he wasn't the answer to her problems. Ashley had to come to terms with the fact that her marriage had been in trouble long before the affair. She had been unhappy for a long time, but instead of addressing the issues with Kevin, she had sought solace in someone else's arms. It was a painful realization, but it was the first step toward healing. She started seeing a therapist, something she had never considered before. The therapy sessions helped her understand the deeper issues that had plagued her relationship with Kevin, and more importantly, with herself. She had allowed her insecurities to define her, and that had sabotaged her marriage. As the months passed, Ashley began to regain her sense of self. She focused on her career, something that had always been a source of pride for her, and slowly rebuilt her social circle. The healing process was long, and there were days when she felt like she was drowning in her own regret. But with each passing day, the burden became a little easier to bear. She understood now that she had to take responsibility for her actions, but she also had to forgive herself in order to move forward. Ashley's love life remained non-existent for a while. She was cautious now, wary of repeating the same mistakes. She didn't want to rush into another relationship just for the sake of feeling validated. She needed to focus on herself, to rebuild her sense of worth without relying on someone else to define it. One day, out of the blue, Ashley received a message from Kevin. It was simple, just a, "How are you?" But it felt like a turning point. She hadn't expected to hear from him again, and the message stirred a mix of emotions. It was a reminder of everything they had been through, the good and the bad. She had spent so many nights wishing for closure, and now, here it was. They met for coffee a few days later. The reunion was awkward at first, but it was also surprisingly healing. They spoke not as husband and wife, but as two people who had shared a significant part of their lives. Kevin talked about his photography, about the new directions his life was taking, and Ashley shared her journey of self-discovery. They spoke about their marriage, acknowledging the mistakes they both had made, but they did so with a sense of understanding rather than blame. It was clear that neither of them harbored resentment anymore, but they also knew that their paths had diverged beyond repair. The coffee meeting didn't lead to reconciliation, but it did offer something else: peace. Both of them realized that their love had faded, and the damage was too great to undo. They had learned valuable lessons from their time together, lessons they would carry with them into the future. They parted ways that day with no hard feelings, just an understanding that they had each done the best they could with the circumstances they had faced. As the years went on, Ashley and Kevin both moved on. Kevin eventually found love again, a relationship that was grounded in trust and understanding. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, but it was real, and that's what mattered. Ashley, too, found happiness in her own way. She became more involved in charity work, giving back to the community and finding purpose in helping others. She realized that happiness didn't come from external sources, but from within herself. Their lives were different now, and they had both changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. The affair had broken them, but it had also given them the opportunity to rebuild, separately and independently. The pain of their past had faded, replaced by the understanding that sometimes the best thing two people can do for each other is to let go. And in that letting go, they both found freedom.